Hi, welcome to Rontime, the 23rd issue of Rontime. Today's the 19th of December 2014, the last show for the year. So, for those of you waiting for me to do the last show of the year, this is it. And for those of you that like to call up and talk about my show, please remember it's tape recorded once every 2 months now and played frequently or often. So if you call me and expect me to answer your questions online, that's not a live show. So appreciate your calls, though, especially the feedback from Longview, where the short view seems to prevail. In several things have happened recently that have made me relatively optimistic about the future of our nation. The first thing that happened is that we're going to normalize relationships with Cuba after 50 years of idiocy because they were communist and supported by the Russians and had missiles and scared the crap out of the Kennedys and stuff. That pleases me a lot because my daughter-in-law is from a Cuban family in Miami. And I've always liked Cuba. I love the architecture there. It'd be fun to go there and be a restoration historic architect. And, put some of the facades of the former glory of the place back together. Cuban citizens are actually allowed to buy property in Havana, and that means that ownership is going to begin to show the kind of pride and investment that just didn't exist under the current system of government, where no one could own private property because it was a communist country. It turns out, because of the boycott of 50 years, the embargo, they're actually very good organic farmers. They were forced to become good organic farmers because they couldn't really afford to buy pesticides and fertilizers and other artificial ingredients that were being blockaded by the United States naval blockade of Cuba. So, and interestingly enough, their system of medicine is really quite advanced. And doctors don't get paid any more than the nurses or the administrators that work in the same hospital as them. So there might be some interesting things to look at in terms of our health system and cost cutting and how to get everybody in the United States covered so that you're not wiped out by a medical emergency or an expensive hospital procedure similar to, well, events that have led people to believe that everyone ought to have universal coverage and that everybody ought to have the same coverage that the Congress has. The Congress, by the way, has made a lot of laws to support themselves in ways that you and I cannot take advantage of those systems of support. My favorite one is the fact that members of Congress are allowed to invest on the basis of information that they've heard in closed hearings behind doors. And if you and I did the same thing, we'd be under investigation by the Securities and Exchange Commission for insider trading. So it's very interesting. This week also learned that members of Congress who have children who have college loans, they're not responsible to pay them back. So Congresspersons' children's are not going to suffer from the kind of student loan debt weight that many American college graduates incur. in order to be able to gain the degrees that they need to enter the profession that they believe will pay off all their student loans. There's a Pew study being conducted now, which I've been asked to fill out, that asks if your college curriculum and your degree, your studies, were a positive force in determining your career and getting you hired or getting you a job, or if in fact they did not at all lead to the work that you did in your lifetime. And most of the people that have been sent this form to fill out concerning this questionnaire are considerably younger than me, so I may be kind of skewing the answers towards the gray side of the scale. The gray side of the scale, as a result of this past midterm election, it's clear that people are fed up with government, but they're so fed up with it that they don't even want to deal with it. I know that all the advertisements that were purchased for this election cycle make it the most expensive election ever in the history of a democratic government, and that since they know they're going to have a majority in Congress in both houses, the Republicans are pushing to repeal the kind of protection that from banks that the Dodd-Frank legislation was supposed to help us with, and that the Consumer Protection Agency is supposed to be assisting us with. This week I got my first mailing from someone seeking to have support for Hillary for president. And I certainly can't support her for president, not with all the work that she's done for Monsanto around the world, one of the most toxic, nasty corporations on earth. And the only person that I could potentially support for president would be Elizabeth Warren. And I don't know if she'll be able to make a candidacy at this, by 2016 or not. She seems to be very level-headed, very straightforward. And like John McCain said this week, the federal government of the United States can make mistakes and own up to those mistakes and tell the truth. And if we were to do that in several areas, you would see massive improvements in the United States of America. Behind me, you'll see a little symbol that I've been drawing on lately called the 525, which represents the 5% of the population of the earth that American citizens are. And 25 represents the 25% of the world's prisoners that are incarcerated in the United States of America, the highest rate ever in incarceration, including the Russian gulags and the many prisons that were run by the Nazi Germans in the Second World War. The reason for that is something called mandatory sentencing for first-time nonviolent drug offenders. And it's something that was pushed on the states and pushed on legislators by the Koch brothers so that they could get 20 cents an hour prison labor in their for-profit prisons through Correctional Corporation of America and other for-profit prisons. 95% of the shareholders of which are Republicans. So those 5% of Democrats that own shares in for-profit prisons, you better clean up your act and get out of there, because you're messing with the wrong stuff. Turning a profit off of the misery of other people who are incarcerated for nothing more complex than possession of an herb is a ridiculous way to run a democracy and demand that the Chinese reveal to us whether or not they've ever used torture. et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So if John McCain's telling the truth and the federal government's going to tell the truth, then we're going to have to go revisit the 1937 Marijuana Tax Act, in which a white supremacist racist pig named Harry Anslinger testified before Congress that darkies who smoked reefer thought they were good enough to dance with white women. And that's why he had to make it enemy number one, so that the federal agents coming off of alcohol revenuers and alcohol, tobacco, and firearms were going to have jobs in a guaranteed cops and robbers scam that puts 4 out of 5 prisoners in America today, persons of color. A black or Hispanic youth is 5 times more likely to be stopped for a traffic violation than a white youth. A person of color walking in a neighborhood is suspect and subject to all kinds of investigation by the police, to the degree that you've seen shootings such as Trevon Raver or whatever the guy's name was in Florida, where stand your ground laws have protected the gun-bearing citizens of Florida. A place where Governor Jeb Bush, or ex-governor, I don't know what he is anymore, might run for president. So that would make 41, 43, and 45. Isn't that odd? They want to be president on odd numbers. Anyhow, I'm still looking for a good company to send a couple of Bushes to Iraq on a permanent basis. But since I'm a cannabis criminal, like 5.5 other million Americans, those of us who are arrested once every 37 seconds for marijuana, we can't vote. We don't have civil rights. And it looks like John McCain's going to have to establish some sort of Truth and Reconciliation Council where people who were arrested under these statutes that are based on the use of fraudulent artifice before the Congress of the United States of America in 1937, the profit potential in housing criminals who have done nothing violent and don't pose any threat to society in general. It's a pattern that the Rockefeller, after Attica State Prison riot, insisted on mandatory sentences and very stiff penalties for drugs, because he said they contributed to the violence and the murder of prison guards as well as inmates. And then during the Nixon administration, they sought out purposely the testimony of the DEA and other federal agencies who were involved in the war on drugs, and they exaggerated the effect of cannabis on society, not quite to the same extent as Harry Anslinger when he said it makes darkies think they're good enough to dance with white women. What the Nixon administration was told during their hearings to establish mandatory sentencing for nonviolent crimes was that this was a gateway drug that led to everything else, that had no medical benefits whatsoever, and that it should remain a Class 1 narcotic. Interestingly enough, the definition of narcotic is a substance that the body cannot live without if it's withdrawn. There is no withdrawal symptoms from cannabis, and no one has ever OD'd on cannabis. So it does not fit the definition of a narcotic at all. But you have to remember that Harry Anslinger had axe to grind because he was a white supremacist and a racist. And by the way, in the 1920s, he was shaved on a weekly basis, his entire body. And I don't know about you, but I don't know anybody else who was doing that back then, and I think it's a little weird. But then again, J. Edgar Hoover used to go home from the FBI and put on a frilly pink dress and smoke cigars and sip brandy or whiskey. So you can't exactly say that law enforcement in the United States has been a shining example of moral character and truth in advertising. If you took all the people out of jail that are there for nonviolent drug offenses, you would remove the guarantees made to many states by these for-profit prison companies of profitability at 90% occupancy. And if you're like the state of Arizona, you capitulated to all the money of the Koch brothers and you allowed them to establish for-profit prisons in Arizona for other states, not just for our prisoners. And so you'll find prisoners in Arizona from Hawaii, Washington, Oregon, all over the place because we have the capacity with all these for-profit prison beds. By the way, last year alone, the governor gave a $10 million check to these for-profit prison companies to make them 90% occupancy guaranteed. And the taxpayers of the state of Arizona pick that up when they're not 90% occupied and therefore not profitable. Interesting piece of legislation. Kind of like the piece of legislation that was slipped into the federal budget bill that John McCain is going to allow Consolidated Copper Company, pardon me, to do an open pit mine in Superior on land which is sacred to the native Apache tribes, pardon me, that have been in that area for centuries and centuries. You notice they sneak these little goodies in on a bill that has to pass. Interesting timing. Democracy chokes me up sometimes. Sorry about that. But when the government needs to be authorized with one of these spending bills to keep running, all the jobs that are dependent upon it create a lot of pressure on Congress to sneak things in at the last second because everybody's going to have to vote. It's not one of those where committees are going to hold hearings and they're going to, debate or argue or discuss or even talk about the real points of the legislation. They shove it under the table and give you a real fast and slick 2-day opportunity to read a 6,000 or 600-page bill and make sure that it passes. Otherwise, the government goes out of business and we have another shutdown. The last one, which was caused by the Tea Party Republicans, cost $77 million in lost revenue and over $700 million in lost taxes. So it wasn't a wise thing to do Fortunately, they averted a shutdown this time. But the Slick Willie stuff that they put in at the back end of the bill that nobody ever got around to reading before the vote is going to come into law. And yeah, it's very interesting. What a way to run a democracy. And we are the light of the world. Remember that. So everybody's looking at us for examples. So if we're the example and we're only 5% of the population and we have 25% of the world's prisoners, then that says to the rest of the world, it's okay for democracy to be based upon the suffering of others. And clearly that's not very Buddhist, because Buddhists say that, suffering, attachment is the source of suffering. And that if you have no attachments, then you have no opportunity for suffering. But our attachments are everywhere. The United States government has spent $5 trillion in the past decade trying to secure oil supplies for the United States throughout the world. $5 trillion. That's 5,000 billion dollars. That's so much money, it's ridiculous. And look at the results of it. A really bad experience in Afghanistan, an even worse experience in Iraq, and why? To secure oil overseas so we will always have a supply, and at taxpayer expense. I mean, it's interesting to see Dick Cheney opening his big fat mouth again about the torture and all of that and saying he'd do it over and over. Why doesn't he tell us how much money he made through Halliburton in the Iraq War? And why is the federal government of the United States a revolving door for these guys to go into government, into business, back into government, back into business, and back into government? And then look at the fact that the Congress of the United States has retirement benefits and health benefits for life from serving one term, one single term. So it's clear that the problem is the Congress of the United States, which hasn't made any significant changes to law in the past 6 years, because all they've been doing is trying to fight Mr. Obama, because they resent the fact that the first black president was elected in their lifetime, and that they weren't prepared for that they're actually racist in their attitudes, they don't like blacks, and they don't like him. So they tried to paint him as a Muslim, they tried to paint him as a foreigner because he was born in Hawaii when it wasn't a state, etc., etc., etc. So, if the Congress of the United States would stop making laws to protect themselves and their paycheck and their retirement and their wealth, and start paying attention to the citizens of the United States who don't need elections where you can have unlimited spending by corporations. And the citizens of the United States don't need the Supreme Court to say that a corporation has personhood and therefore has rights. So, if these things are going to change, then maybe the president needs to sign the proclamation, Harry Anslinger Day, which I've sent to him numerous times, which would legalize hemp and cannabis in the United States for commercial crops and end our dependence upon oil altogether. So, until next year, have a nice day.